was no ordinary man. He was the Son of God. Yet he suffered in ways no human could ever imagine. Betrayed by a friend, abandoned by those who once swore loyalty, he stood alone, judged by the very people he came to save. The night was heavy with sorrow as he was dragged through the streets. Chains bound his hands, but it was love that truly held him captive. His flesh was torn by merciless whips, each strike a reminder of humanity's sin. The crown of thorns pierced his head, a cruel mockery of the king he truly was. They spat on him, laughed at him, and struck him without mercy. Yet, with every blow, he bore the pain silently, carrying the burden of the world on his shoulders. Blood dripped from his wounds, marking the path he would walk, a path that led to ultimate sacrifice. This is not just a story of suffering. It is a story of love beyond comprehension, of a man who willingly endured the unimaginable so that we could live. This is the story of Jesus on his final journey. The final day of the Son of Man began in a quiet garden under the cover of night. There, in the stillness of Gethsemane, he prayed with a weight so heavy that his sweat became like drops of blood. He knew what lay ahead. He knew the betrayal, the humiliation, the pain, and yet he stayed. "Father," he whispered, his voice trembling, "if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." His words were filled with both agony and surrender, an unshakable obedience to the plan of salvation. It was in this sacred moment that the silence was shattered. Footsteps approached, torches lit the darkness, and there stood Judas, a friend turned betrayer. With a kiss, Jesus was handed over to the hands of his enemies. The temple guards seized him like a criminal, binding his hands, as though ropes could contain the one who commanded the heavens and the earth. Dragged through the night, he was taken to the high priests, mocked and accused. False witnesses rose against him, twisting his words, desperate to condemn him. Yet through it all, he remained silent. Like a lamb before its shearers, he did not open his mouth. The Son of God who had healed the sick, calmed the storm, and raised the dead, now stood bound, humiliated, and alone. The people who once praised him with cries of Hosanna now turned their backs, blinded by lies and fear. The first hours of his last day were marked by betrayal, anguish, and rejection. Yet he carried it all with unfathomable grace. This was only the beginning. The night gave way to a cold and merciless morning. Jesus, battered and bound, was dragged before the powerful men of his time. First, the high priests, Caiaphas, and the council stood as his judges. They hurled accusations, twisting his words, mocking his claim to be the Son of God. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" they demanded. Jesus, calm amidst the chaos, lifted his eyes and said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The room erupted. Anger filled the hearts of the religious leaders as they cried, "Blasphemy! He deserves death!" But these men had no power to carry out such a sentence. They needed Rome. And so Jesus was dragged from one judgment hall to another. He was taken to Pilate, the Roman governor, a man more concerned with politics than truth. Pilate studied him, confused by the crowd's hatred. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Jesus, steady and resolute, replied, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate found no fault in him, but the voices of the mob grew louder. "Crucify him!" they shouted, their rage drowning out reason. Seeking to appease the crowd, Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, but Herod too mocked him. They placed a robe of royalty on his shoulders, jeering, "Hail, King of the Jews!" before sending him back to Pilate. Pilate, trapped between justice and fear, gave in to the demands of the mob. He washed his hands, declaring, "I am innocent of this man's blood." But the judgment was passed. The innocent was condemned. The King of Glory was sentenced to die a criminal's death. The road to Calvary was paved with suffering. A heavy wooden cross was placed on his torn and bleeding shoulders, a burden not just of wood, but of the sins of all humanity. The crowd pressed around him, some mocking, others weeping, yet few truly understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding before their eyes. Step by step, Jesus walked the path of his own execution. His body, already weakened by the brutal scourging, stumbled under the weight. The Roman soldiers, impatient and ruthless, forced a man named Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross for him. Simon, pulled from the crowd, became a witness to the suffering of the Savior, a suffering that would bring redemption to the world. As he walked, women in the crowd cried out in sorrow. But Jesus, even in his agony, turned to them and said, "Do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." His words were a reminder that the pain of this moment was not the end. It was part of a greater plan. The journey was slow and excruciating, the weight of the cross pressing deeper into his raw flesh with every step. The jeers of the crowd rang out, mingled with the crack of the soldiers' whips. "If you are the Son of God, save yourself," they shouted, blind to the truth that he was walking this path not for himself, but for them. At last, he reached the place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. The cross was laid on the ground, and Jesus was stripped of his garments, his dignity taken along with them. The nails were driven into his hands and feet, piercing not only his flesh, but the very heart of creation. The King was lifted high, not on a throne, but on a cross. The cross stood tall on the hill of Golgotha, a brutal symbol of shame and death. The King of Kings now hung between two criminals, his body torn, his breath labored. Above his head, a sign read mockingly, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." But this was no mockery. This was truth. The crowd gathered at the foot of the cross, their voices filled with mockery and scorn. "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross," they taunted. The soldiers gambled for his clothing, showing no mercy for the man who had come to bring salvation. Yet, even in his suffering, Jesus spoke words of love and forgiveness. "Father, forgive them," he prayed, "for they know not what they do." These were not words of anger or despair, but of grace. A grace that extended to those who mocked, those who doubted, and even those who nailed him to the cross. One of the criminals beside him joined in the insults, but the other rebuked him, saying, "We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve." but this man has done nothing wrong." Then, turning to Jesus, he pleaded, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, even in his agony, responded with hope. "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." As the hours passed, the sky grew dark. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, an unnatural darkness covered the land. Creation itself seemed to mourn its creator. And then, at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The weight of sin and separation bore down upon him. The Savior of the world was now fully immersed in the depths of suffering, carrying the sins of humanity to the point of ultimate sacrifice. The darkness lingered over Golgotha as the Son of God hung on the cross, his body broken, his spirit burdened. Each breath was a struggle, each moment a step closer to the fulfillment of his mission. Those who watched could see the weight of agony etched into his face. Yet his resolve remained unshaken. In his final moments, Jesus looked down at those he loved. To his mother Mary, standing in grief, he spoke tenderly, "Woman, behold your son." And to his beloved disciple John, "Behold your mother." Even in his suffering, his heart was filled with compassion, ensuring his mother would be cared for. Then, with a voice that echoed across eternity, Jesus declared, "It is finished." These were not words of defeat, but of victory. The work was complete. The debt of sin was paid. The divide between God and humanity had been bridged. The Savior had done what no one else could. He bore the weight of the world's sin and fulfilled the will of the Father. As his final breath left his body, he cried out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." At that moment, the earth itself trembled. The ground shook, the rocks split, and the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. A divine declaration that the barrier between God and man was no more. The Roman centurion standing guard looked upon the crucified king and exclaimed, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Even in death, Jesus' divinity could not be denied. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, had given his life for the salvation of all. His suffering was over, but his victory had just begun. The cross, once a symbol of shame, now stood as a beacon of hope and redemption for all who would believe. The story does not end with death. The cross, once a symbol of suffering, became the greatest symbol of victory. Jesus' sacrifice was not in vain. It was the ultimate act of love, bridging the gap between humanity and God. Through his pain, we are healed. Through his death, we have life. The question now is, what does the cross mean to you? It is a call to reflect, to surrender, and to embrace the love that was poured out for you. This is not just a story of the past. It is a story for today, for all of us. A story of redemption and hope that continues to change lives. Thank you for joining us in remembering the final day of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. If this message touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Let's continue sharing this story with the world so more people can experience the hope and love of Jesus. May God bless you, and may his grace and peace fill your heart always.